Morning, everybody, and thank you very much for dialing in to attend the webinar this morning on the future of share schemes. I'm very pleased to welcome Malcolm Hurlston, Chairman of the Esop Centre and one of the denizens of the share scheme movement in the UK, to talk about the future of share schemes. We're going to aim to discuss the topic for about 45 minutes. And although we won't be taking questions on the webinar itself, we'd be very happy to receive questions afterwards, and Malcolm or I will respond to them appropriately. Just to introduce the topics, rather the speakers. Malcolm Hurlston is the chairman and founder of the Esop Centre. He's chairman of the Financial Inclusion and Market Centre, got a wide-ranging history, very interesting background and career. Also founder of the Consumer Credit Counselling Service, and he was awarded a CBE in the 2013 Queen's New Year's Honours List. So we're very pleased to have Malcolm here today to give us his perspective on the future of share schemes in the UK. My background is summarised on the slide, a lot less varied and interesting than Malcolm's, I think it's probably fair to say. So the format of today is aimed at, we've got 7 questions which are intended to provoke discussion and hopefully will be thought-provoking and interesting for everybody. And I'm going to start by asking Malcolm to look back in time and think back to the inception of share schemes and to comment on the progress that's been made.
Since share schemes started in the United Kingdom, we've developed an industry perhaps second to none in range and expertise in helping to make share schemes available both nationally and internationally. That's been a very important building block. Perhaps most importantly, the government pretty happily puts £1 billion a year behind share schemes. That money coming in tax breaks of one kind and another from HMRC, which seems to be uncontested in the sense that the government, HMRC's assessment are that that has been value for money from the government's point of view. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of major threat to that. The other thing I would note from share schemes has been progress in the alignment of interest between people who work for companies and the shareholders, to a certain extent by making them the same people. And that has been extremely healthy for progress and productivity in industry.
That's an interesting perception. There's been a lot of debate about the future of share schemes, potential reform, development. Would you say that the progress we've had so far has gone far enough?
To go back to the first question, in a way, what is the share schemes industry? The share schemes industry is not an end in itself. It's a vehicle for achieving things. The centre is particularly in favour of 2 things. It's in favour of all employee share ownership, and it's also in favour of the spread of capital wealth. As Lewis Kelso said in the first place, this is what we're kind of aiming to do, is to spread the wages of capital and to bring everybody, all employees we can do, into it. Have share schemes achieved that? Well, the answer is probably no to that one. They haven't really succeeded in helping all the lower paid people as much as they might have done yet. And it's rather odd that the government has put all this money behind it without providing the kind of nudge effect that modern government tends to do. So that, and this I think comes from the structure that's come around all this, that you have business under its different names, which is responsible for business getting on, making progress, small businesses and large. Then you have the Treasury, and then you have HMRC, which is a kind of semi-detached part of the Treasury, which has been responsible largely for share schemes. Now, it's kind of odd that when several of the more recent moves in share schemes have taken place, mainly the initiative has come from the Treasury. The people of the other departments haven't known what's happening. There's been quite a lack of coordination, a surprising lack of coordination on the government side. So that I think we have a situation where share schemes get tinkered with, looked at kind of one by one without an overall policy for them. For example, when George Osborne very kindly doubled the monthly contribution that you could make to ShareSave, it's not something that we asked for. I don't think anybody else did particularly. I don't think anybody thought that that would be very much taken up, other than by rather small categories of people. And certainly in other departments, people were taken aback by it. George Osborne was also responsible for one of the share schemes we don't have, one of the few that's actually dropped off the agenda, employee shareholder status, which is not such a wild idea in some respects, but on the other hand, came in without any kind of consultation. So the share schemes industry hasn't really had coordinated government support and hasn't had much kind of nudge support of government, mainly because HMRC sits slightly apart. And over the many years when the HMRC statistics have come out, each time I've sought to encourage the government minister at one end or the other to say something about it. But there's always been a very kind of after you, Claude approach here. Nobody was quite sure who ought to be making the statement. And only once that we had a statement, and that was from Shriti Vadera when she was at business, because she also had close relations with the Treasury at the time and felt free to do it. So we do need a lot more government coordination. We need government which does nudge as well as putting in money. And because of the way in which share plans have gone forward, they've developed, I would say, incoherently. People have looked at them one by one. Been Gordon Brown did a fantastic job with the EMI, Employee Management Incentives, still very widely regarded worldwide as something to emulate from the point of view of encouraging relatively small but significant numbers of people in fast-growing small businesses, and that's been extremely good. He had one or two goes at what eventually became the SIP, which has not yet perhaps reached the unquoted company as much as it might. But there hasn't been coordination across the piece. We've seen individual ministers with good ideas pushing something forward without an overall plan for share schemes. Also, perhaps the whole share scheme world is out of date. It was invented at a time before we had the Financial Conduct Authority. It was invented at a time when saving seemed like a good idea for everybody. Things have moved on. We're into a world where people probably expect to stay in jobs less long time than they used to. When employers too I mean, the rhetoric about a lot of share schemes at the beginning was encouraging people to stay on far longer than their employers now generally would want someone to stay on. And share schemes haven't really caught up with all these new trends in employment, and where perhaps, and this is where it kind of goes against some of the earliest principles, but perhaps you need to be looking at portability in share schemes rather than share schemes which just encourage people, or intended to encourage people to stay longer in the business than the business wants them. So a lot of deep thinking needs to be done. We've got a great infrastructure there. We've got loads of expertise, but is anybody driving it?
The idea of portability is not one I've come across before. Are you able to expand on how you might see that potentially working?
No, well, I've got no idea how it ought to work, except that you have to look at people's long-term needs, and if you have to accept that people are not going to stay in jobs all that long, you're not going to find share schemes interesting them all that much. So how do you use the infrastructure in order to be able to meet people's current needs? It's something to be looked at. It's not something for which there is a clear answer. If we go back to 1900, the amazing thing then was that in 1900, over half of employment was in domestic service. In some respects, with the gig economy, we're moving back towards that, where people are doing not full-time jobs, not secure jobs. They're doing things for people that they could have done themselves, delivering food, rather than people cooking it for themselves at home and so forth. So we're seeing a whole new way of working, where even if we don't have by sort of 2020, 2025, half the people in domestic service, a pretty large proportion of the workforce will be supplementing through the gig economy and creating a kind of domestic service part two. But particularly, there was a feeling that robots and artificial intelligence would be in future putting a lot of people out of jobs. But in a way, they seem to be doing now the high value jobs and creating sort of low value jobs down the line. So how are we going to deal with a world like that? Now, this is the thinking part of stuff. More thinking needs to be done. We've got this beautiful vehicle. How can we make it work for the future, for all employees, and for the economy?
Some interesting thoughts there, and I think that the sort of challenges that you've identified are replicated internationally, which really leads on to the next question, which probably ought to be expressed in both directions. In terms of the question that we've got is, what lessons can we learn from the international share schemes landscape? I think there's also the question there of what lessons the world outside the UK may have learned from the UK's experience.
I think internationally, one of the things that struck me most hearing presentations at our events over the years is that a few years back, people would come and say how they tried to make their international share scheme work in such a way that the effects of share save were being replicated in 72 countries as closely as that could possibly be done. And this is what people took pride in. Gradually, it became clear that perhaps it wasn't worthwhile going to a great deal of effort. 7 people in Kiribati to create the same kind of tax circumstances where they didn't naturally exist. And I've noted with international share schemes, there has been an increasing tendency to forget about the tax breaks altogether and look at the bigger picture, to look at, you know, what is the most important thing in the international share scheme? Well, it is the share price which creates something that binds people together, whichever part of the company or whichever part of the world they're coming from. So perhaps perhaps the development of the use of shares in the United Kingdom may have something to learn from that. Perhaps we are too driven by the financial advantages of share schemes and not enough by the bigger picture. I think this is one of the things that may be there to be learned from international schemes.
That makes me think of a point that was raised at a seminar I attended some time ago, where it was suggested that having tax breaks for share schemes in a domestic environment might actually inhibit the development of international share schemes because of the resulting complexity that drives to try to achieve all of those tax breaks.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that what we've seen with share schemes in the United Kingdom is that individual ministers at certain times wanted to do something which they thought at the time was in the interests of UK PLC or their constituents or the particular kind of people who voted for their party. And that's what it all built from. It hasn't particularly been built from the idea of, you know, capital wealth spreading to the whole of the community or everybody getting a share and stuff. So that to the extent that sort of share schemes work, they're designed to work in order to improve productivity or whatever it might be in the particular circumstances of the United Kingdom. It obviously is a bit silly to try to extend that into other countries. And I think if you look at the take-up of international share schemes, generally, you see that people has to be quite a strong kind of Anglo-Saxon influence in order for the take-up to be at decent levels, because, you know, people just don't understand what we're going on about.
Yes, no, I can see that. And I suppose the other big issue when looking at international circumstances, which is difficult to avoid in any discussion of the current climate, is the impact of Brexit, thinking particularly in terms of how Brexit will change, if at all, the shape of share schemes.
I'm not very well placed to be a kind of pundit on Brexit, being one of the relatively few people who believe that our freedom is beyond price. Nonetheless, Brexit is certainly going to lead to complications in the administration of international share schemes, without any doubt at all. And that is a point to be looked at within the context of how we exit from the European Union. There was a general expectation that Brexit will have a delaying effect on people's decision making. And this is an expectation that has, for one reason or another, proved wrong in practice. Economic activity has gone a bit faster than everybody expected. Now that's something I've been entirely wrong myself. I thought there'd be a great deal of waiting, you know, hang on, let's see what happens. We won't do something this year, we'll do it next year. That's not on the whole turned out to be true. But perhaps within the share schemes world, it has had a delaying effect. I wouldn't think that was at all surprising. So the delaying effect might well be the most important of it.
Okay. I had a view which we haven't seen any real evidence of it coming through, that Brexit creates uncertainty. I think everybody, whether remain or leave, would probably agree that it creates uncertainty, and that share schemes being based on growing capital wealth over time might be a way of counterpointing that uncertainty in terms of planning. Have you seen any evidence of supporting or counteracting that?
Well, there's no doubt about it. The great benefit of share schemes is that, you know, on the whole, over a decent period of time, shares tend to go up. Certainly, it's not been true the last month. And we still don't know for certain what we're seeing at the moment, whether it's a crash or correction or what have you. My money on is it's a relatively slight correction, but who knows? But certainly, for share schemes to be significant and for employee shareholding to be significant, they have to be able to look to a period of time. Now, this is where the tension comes at the moment, from what I was talking about earlier, how that many people have shorter term horizons, both employers and employees. But the magic of share schemes and the magic of shares in general only works over an average period of time.
Yes, I can see that. A variation on the question, it's not a Brexit related question, but just picking up on that theme, because one of the challenges that I see with developing share schemes long term, particularly if it's on an all employee basis, is that there can be a tension between conventional financial advice and building up a portfolio of share interests in your own company. Starting point of financial advice is diversification. Hold shares in a company and the company goes bust, you lose your job and you lose your wealth. I think that was one of the issues that came out of the Enron disaster, and for that matter, the financial crisis in the UK. People who had jobs at HBOS received shares in HBOS, had kept the shares and effectively lost all of their wealth. What would be your sort of take on how that ought to be viewed by people within the share scheme space?
If we go back to the very beginning, when I was responsible for first bringing the Esop to the United Kingdom, we said we're doing exactly what they do in the United States. But of course we weren't. We were doing something entirely different. But it gave it a certain credibility at the outset. Now we know that American share schemes are far more pension related. They're treated differently by the OECD for that particular reason. It's an entirely different game over there. And as we all know, that it's necessary after a certain time to have diversification out of employer shares quite often, and that's kind of built into what's an entirely different system. Here we don't have that. Now, how we move on from share schemes, obviously, it's very good if people can, when they have the opportunity, move from one kind of protected share scheme vehicle into some other kind of more widespread vehicle, so that people can plan their own lives in the long term. It's been very unfortunate to me for mainly people have not kind of lost money, but lost expectations in the past. And I have a great deal of sympathy for people, particularly in the banks, and particularly sort of middle level in the banks, who had built up quite substantial expectations in their share schemes, which then kind of went away, particularly unfortunate for them because they have people at branch manager level. You found with people talking about banks, they still love their branch manager, whether one existed or not. In the mind, the branch manager was still popular when banks themselves were hated. And those people have suffered a great deal. But it is a call over time how that can be done. It's difficult increasingly too for companies to give any kind of common sense advice, or for anybody to give common sense advice to people in their employment. They can't give someone a nudge and say, if I were you, I would do that. They're frightened. That's something we really do need to tackle. And in that context, we're talking to the lab at the Financial Reporting Council about whether we can find better ways of getting around that problem. But on the other problem here, I think we have, is the nature of risk. That I was fortunate enough to spend a week at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, doing a course on, among other things, the non-aggregability of risk. So the more risks you pile up, the less risk you have, in the sense that if one thing happens, another won't. And we also know that it's only via taking sort of larger risks that larger rewards are there. So again, you have to have some sympathy with people who want to take the larger risk. You can't nanny people in what they ought to be doing. What you have to be able to do is to make it clear to people what the options are, to make it easy for them to take those decisions, but not necessarily to take the decisions out of their hands.
Yes, no, I can see that logic. That probably leads on to think about the impact of millennials and share schemes. And we've got statistics which show that millennials are expected to be forming 57% of the workforce by 2020. And there are challenges for millennials, or rather for employers of millennials, as to how share schemes can adapt to engage effectively that population who may have a shorter term expectation of continuity of employment, whereas share schemes is predicated on that very nature of long-term employment. What would be your views on how the share scheme industry and employers could reach out to the millennial population?
I find millennials a particularly difficult topic to kind of pontificate on, really, because we're seeing different things from different sides of the spectrum. I mean, I was reading only yesterday that millennials don't grow up now until they're sort of 26, whereas they used to grow up when they were 21, because they do more education, get married later. They don't reach these kind of life stages. Whereas on the other hand, obviously millennials want to be able to vote at 16 and take on the responsibilities at the other end. There's not much evidence yet that millennials, by the time they get to 45 or 50, will behave any differently than from previous generations. And again, I think it's not all that much evidence that people are ever very interested in the long term in that kind of age group, millennials or not, between 20, 25, 30, where people always thinking about their future, their careers, their pensions. I pull the other one. I don't think there ever was a time when that was at the forefront of people's minds. So it comes back to the question of, at least for the time you have the employer-employee relationship, how that is going to work best, even if the millennials' time horizon is a different one. I think it's still possible to interest everybody in the idea that for people who are there for a certain stage, that there ought to be a transfer of wealth. I think the whole thinking behind the Esop, that there ought to be a sharing of the wages of capital, is a good one. And for millennial, it might not happen in this job, it might happen in the next one, but it's still a good thing to be doing. All share schemes, all benefit schemes are at base something to talk to employees about. All employers have this request: we want to be nice to our employees, but how do you do it? And having a topic of interest is the most important thing. So the share scheme can be a topic of interest, even if it's not something that millennials will immediately buy into if they're thinking about something else. But they can see it as being a good thing for the company to do, and a good thing for themselves at some later stage.
It's interesting the point about a later stage. I read some research in the US talking about millennials, and the theme of the research was that actually the millennials today are no different from the 20-year-old something or others 20, 30 years ago. It's just that there's been the focus on it. In which case, maybe the challenge is to make share schemes attractive to the younger generation, millennials today, but in 20 years' time, it'll be the people being born today.
I think so, yeah. You've got to make them look as attractive as they can, but you obviously have to accept that if people have a shorter time horizon, it's going to be extremely difficult to tailor a share scheme for a very short-term perspective.
And is there a point in that about the importance when designing, when implementing a share scheme, about the importance of communication, but also linked to that education, financial education, as to what share schemes are about?
I think financial education is particularly difficult. I've lost track of the number of times people in companies have told me about employees at the highest level who didn't have a clue what to do. There seems to be this basic stuff now that people have up and down the age range, up and down the education range, and some people have NOUS and some people don't. And education is very difficult to educate people about stuff until the moment when they're interested in it, until it really matters. Most of the research ever carried out on financial education has shown it doesn't work. There is no body of evidence, either here or in the United States, in favour of it. It tends to be promoted by those people who are delivering it. But the evidence is really very thin for financial education. My kind of personal view is there's nothing so useful as no level in bookkeeping or the equivalent, something which teaches you how to add up, to have a look every month where you are across the whole financial spectrum. And we found again in the past that people who hadn't got a degree in mathematics or anything, but filled in the football pools, were extremely good at doing permutations and combinations without spending a lot of money on giving them financial education expensively. I mean, the other aspect of financial education that we haven't, I think, fully used yet is how much can be done in an automated way. Because what people want or really need is easy access to the right kind of information at the time they need it. And I think we need to make a kind of a serious effort, really, as an industry, to make sure that that kind of information is regularly available to people at the time when it really does matter. You're not going to get people to take, if one takes a credit card, for example, it's very difficult to think about the credit card until you can have one. That creates an entirely different set of circumstances. But in all kinds of financial education, it is having the information available at the right time that matters most. Easy, comprehensible, and I would like to see something perhaps agreed with the agreed with the FCA, which could be industry-wide, online financial education where people can do their own what-ifs.
Yeah, I can see the attraction of that. Moving topic, but still looking at the same generation. There's a question which I'll expand on the next two slides as to whether share schemes could be used to moderate the distortions of our, use the word, erratic income tax system. And before asking you to comment on that, I probably ought just to look at a couple of slides that we've got which try to make the point. And what we're referring to here by the erratic system is that if you view the student loans and the repayment of student loans as a form of tax, what the analysis of statistics demonstrates is that the incremental rate of tax is highest for graduates. That's shown on the slide there, showing the percentages of income tax for pensioners, employees, and new graduates, and you'll see that the lowest percentages for pensioners, because they don't have student loans to repay. They're not subject to national insurance contributions, which is a big impact on the way that the effective tax rates are put together. And the same point is demonstrated by reference to marginal rates of tax on the next slide. You'll see the somewhat shocking figures there in the range of 100,000 to 122,000 of income, showing marginal rates of tax at 71% for graduates who are required to repay student loans. Now, this is part of a much wider debate about the structure of the economy and inequality and disincentives for graduates. If it's accepted that there is that erratic nature of the tax system, to what extent do you think that share schemes could potentially be used to counteract that?
I mean, our focus has always been really more on capital than income. So we're interested in kind of the wages of capital reaching employees, and income is a different game, and one in a way that share schemes, as we know it, weren't designed to deal with. I did at one stage chair the student loans company, and I failed to spot at the time that these weren't really loans but collateral obligations, and as I understand it, only about a quarter, if that, of people with student loans will end up paying them off via this system. So it's perhaps an exaggeration to look at income tax in this way. I think it's difficult for share schemes to step into this territory as far as I can see. But I don't know whether you have any ideas you'd like to kind of put to me on it.
Well, I think it was really putting it out there as a question for debate, and I suppose you could, to a certain extent, challenge the position, because what you've just said, and I think it's correct, is that share schemes are designed at encouraging capital growth, and capital growth tends to be long-term, and it tends to be taxed at lower rates. And if you then combine that with what we've been saying about the design of share schemes not necessarily appealing to millennials or the younger generation, it's possible to argue that what share schemes will do will be to promote the growth of capital, which will be realised at a later stage in somebody's life cycle, in which case they will be no longer at the blue level because they will have gone through the experience of repaying the loans. So arguably the way that the share schemes are set up would be accentuating those tendencies. And I suppose that thinking about that, one way of potentially trying to address that, I'd be interested in your views, would be to try to develop the share scheme so that there's encouragement not only to participate in the capital value, but to participate in a regular dividend stream with, subject to the usual requirements, to have a tax advantage scheme with a preferential tax rate. Don't know whether you've thought about that or seen that in other jurisdictions, whether that's something which will be worth exploring further.
Is perhaps the EOT a step in that direction?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Already.
Yes.
Already kind of exists, and that's begun to be explored. Which the EOT, I suppose, in a sense, was created in order to put John Lewis employees on the same footing as people in share schemes.
Yes. I mean, for people who are not on the call, are not familiar with EOTs, that's employee ownership trusts. And the point that Malcolm is alluding to there is that where you have a company which is owned by a qualifying employee ownership trust, there is the ability for tax-free bonuses of up to 3,600 to be paid on an all-employee basis, which is definitely a step in that direction.
So it's not impossible to find routes of that kind. I suppose this is particularly maybe even one-off, but because all of our share schemes are the moment one-off one way or another, there must be ways of doing it. These kind of equity between groups is always quite difficult to deal with, isn't it? It's I don't know whether you're the kind of cyclist who hates pedestrians and motorists, or vice versa, but there are some people who are able to take an all-round view at any one moment. There are other people who very much belong to the category of person they are at the moment.
I'm the sort of cyclist who almost kills himself when he gets on a bike, so I tend not to do so. I mean, I think linked to that, we come to our final question. I know this is something which you've written about recently in Newspad in a different context. But one of the first types of share plan, although it wasn't at the time called Company Share Ownership Plan, it was Executive Share Scheme, 1984 Finance Act, was reformed in the 1990s to be targeted at lower levels of participation, going down from £100,000 or 4 times earnings, whichever was the higher, to the current limit of awards over shares worth no more than 30,000, which was driven at the time by the ASDA share scheme, which you will no doubt recall.
Archie Norman,
indeed. So that the reform was originally to reduce the limit to 20,000. That was found not to be consistent with the way that the ASDA plan was being created. And that was an example of the company share option plan, or the CSOP, being used on an all-employee basis. And I know that the CSOP is something that you've spoken about and written about quite frequently. So what do you see the future holding for the CSOP?
It's still rather difficult to be positive about the future for the CSOP. It's been around a long time. And whereas most things in an imperfect world suffer from the problems of over-intermediation, the CSOP has always suffered from the problem in the way of under-intermediation. One of the good things you can say about the CSOP is it's something that companies can offer their employees, or the employee with NOWS can ask for. On the other hand, because it's such a inexpensive plan to operate, it doesn't really have anybody pushing for it. I would like to see, I think generally I would like to see employees asking for share plans as well as being given them. I think in the longer term, facing all the uncertainties we are in a changing world, it's not quite enough for share schemes to be kind of pushed at people. What you need is push and pull in the share schemes world, so that you get employees taking a bigger interest themselves in the kind of share plan they ought to have. Employees and, as necessary, their representatives. We need more players in the game, really. We need at government level somebody who will see share plans in the overall context of government policy. Long term, we need for the whole economy share plans to be helping people to get hold of the wages of capital we've always been looking to promise them, and the Employee Share Ownership Trust, which perhaps is now the fifth share plan, fifth Beetle, or no, fifth Beetle got lost, didn't
he? He did, yes.
It's got it's about maybe Osborne's employee share scheme was the fifth Beetle that we got lost. But this is what we need to see. We need to see more players in the game. We need a bigger picture, so that we're not just going along tram lines with share schemes, but that we're finding new ways of helping people in a less certain future.
Okay. If I may just throw one final question in, which we haven't got on the slides, just been prompted by listening to the discussion, because I think that we've identified that share schemes is an area that needs evolution and requires political focus. I know that you've got lots of contacts through your lobbying past with government, with opposition politicians. With the immense focus on Brexit, to what extent do you think the current government, or indeed the next government if Brexit is still happening, will actually have the bandwidth to be able to spend the time and focus on that we need to see share schemes evolve and develop?
Well, looking back over kind of ages doing all this kind of stuff, you don't really notice any difference between the political parties. You notice that somebody gets a bright idea and does it, irrespective of what party. And this is a kind of fits and starts in which things happen in the world of politics. And this is probably the way in which it will, I think, continue to go. Now, we are at a stage in national life, as I see it, where insofar as the battle between kind of the right and the left and nobody else is worth much counting, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn are looking for the same category of voter. They're both really looking for people, the so-called, I suppose, just about managing. They're going to be the swing voters in the next election without any doubt whatsoever. And I'm pretty sure that one or other of the parties will pick more clearly on this. It was something that was very much in, assuming she stays in power long enough, Theresa May's ideas when she was on the hustings before she became elected as leader, that she really wanted to do something for just about managing. And they're the people that she needs to take away from Labour. Labour hasn't yet pitched to just about managing accurately enough, but there's no reason why they shouldn't see that as well.
And share schemes could be part of that.
And share schemes, share schemes could very, very much be part of that. I think Labour policy has not, by any means, developed yet. Jeremy Corbyn has done really kind of an amazing job in changing the face of politics in Britain, of putting policy first, as opposed to the kind of politics where perhaps on both sides we had kind of ministers whose first aim was to have a red box, to have a job, and the second aim was to do policy. And Jeremy's put policy there, But how you turn sort of vague policy into practice, like share schemes, is something where I think it's possible to have hopes of the Shadow Chancellor, who ran a very tight ship when he was at the Greater London Authority in the past. Always proved himself to be a good player comes the moment. And I think there's a great possibility between now and the next election of either of the two major parties picking up on the idea that a good use of share schemes will enable them to reach the voters they really need, which to a large extent is just about managing people, the people we want to see benefiting too.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Malcolm. That's a good way to bring the webinar to a close. I hope everybody has found that interesting, stimulating, provoking of discussion. So it just leaves me to thank everybody for listening. Hope you enjoyed it and hope that we will see you again on future webinars. Thank you very much. Goodbye.